I'd just like to give everyone a trigger warning for yelling, gaslighting, Nazis, transphobia, paedophilia, anxiety, depression, suicide, bullying, and racist and anti-Semitic dog whistles.
I've run round like a moron to unequivocally fail.
So, you remember how Ethel shared those Twitter DMs, and that was bad? Because it was violating someone's right to privacy and betraying their trust? Do you remember that? Well, apparently, that rule only applies if you're trans. It turns out that a little while ago, a trans YouTuber emailed Rachel Oates to ask her directly about her intentions and opinions in regard to this whole controversy, and she shared that email on Twitter without asking, or even mentioning that she'd done it. Can we just take a moment to appreciate how incredibly irresponsible this was? This person contacted Oates through email specifically because they were afraid of backlash from her fans, so what does she do? Point them out to her fans with a giant glowing neon sign. This isn't like what Ethel did to Woodford. It's not like Oates shared this correspondence to shed light on possible gaslighting. It's never had a chance to get that far because she had to go right to 11 and immediately share the initial email. And it's not like this person is a public figure who's already under scrutiny. I know they said they were a YouTuber, but Oates has no way of knowing how big their audience is, assuming they have an audience at all. We simply don't know whether or not they have any experience dealing with this kind of backlash. And she doesn't know this person. For all she knows, they could be mentally ill, or disabled, or both. Honestly, after reading the emails, it wouldn't surprise me. We have no idea how this kind of attention could affect them. I know they're not being contacted about this directly, but that doesn't mean they haven't seen what people are saying about them. The responses are still publicly available on Oates' Twitter, which they've probably been reading. For all we know, Oates' selfish indiscretion could have caused this person to spiral into a depression or start having panic attacks. There's even a possibility that she contributed to a suicide. There are just no words to convey how absolutely disgusted I am with this behavior. And it only gets worse when you actually read the emails. But before we begin, I just need to disclose that there are two topics being discussed in these emails: trans rights and Nazis. Trying to tackle them both at once is too complicated, so for now I'm going to be omitting the Nazi sections, then we'll look at them in isolation later. What this means is that the conversation we'll be looking at will technically be incomplete, so if you want to take my analyses with a grain of salt, then whatever makes you happy. Also, remember those pins. Oates believes in listening charitably, she hates division, and she doesn't make unsubstantiated claims. So, in the initial email, this person has just said that they, as a trans person, do not feel safe in Oates' spaces, and they ask if Oates would like to do anything about that. They also go to the extent of saying they're not accusing Oates of being a bad person, that they're not trying to demonize Woodford, and that they're not trying to divide people. There's also a PS asking Oates if she'd like to discuss everything further in an attempt to understand why people are upset with her, in the hopes of there being some kind of reconciliation. And that's it. In her tweet, Oates describes this email as being slightly odd and feeling kind of aggressive. Now, the odd bit I can agree with, but aggressive? What? This looks like it was intentionally written to be as inoffensive as humanly possible. What the hell is Oates smoking? I'd like to know, so I can avoid it. And now, onto her response. She responds first to the phrase, quote, You say that you stand with the trans community. You assert over and over that you care about trans people and are our ally." Unquote. I have a problem with this because this is only providing context for the actual concern. So, by responding to it on its own, Oates is simply asserting her allyship without evidence, trying to skip over the part where she actually addresses the problem. It's also quite aggressive because she's essentially cutting this person off mid-sentence. I know she addresses the rest later because it's a written medium, but she's still interrupting this person to say that she is a trans ally, and how dare anyone question that. She also says that she's never given herself the label of trans ally, but only been given that label by trans people. This is a way of dismissing a trans person questioning her by saying, "You're not questioning me, you're questioning other trans people," which is just slimy. This is also another example of her using literal interpretations to her advantage. It's technically true that she's never said, "I am a trans ally," but she's repeatedly said that she's only ever supported trans people, which only means something different if you're being dishonest. Let's also not forget that she's viciously attacked trans people for questioning or criticizing her allyship. So, yeah, she's pretty aggressively giving herself the label there. After that, she responds to the fact that this person says they don't feel safe in her spaces. She apologizes, asks what she's done to prompt this feeling and what she can do to rectify it. This is actually great. This is exactly how she should respond. And then you read the massive 11-line paragraph below it. She begins by saying she's confused because she's only ever spoken up in support of trans people. Most of you probably just think this is an honest expression of confusion, but it's not. This was completely unnecessary. Oates had already explained that she didn't know why this person felt the way they did, and she already asked them to explain, so she's essentially repeating herself. Except, well, it's more than that. Remember how I said in part 1 that I was going to explain the difference between a difference of opinion and gaslighting? Well, this comes into play here. Imagine you have a graph with two axes. The x-axis is the level of confidence in your own perspective, and the y-axis is your level of confidence in someone else's perspective. On that graph, gaslighting tends to fall into the lower right quadrant. A gaslighter is extremely confident in their own perspective and extremely cynical of everyone else's. Before, Oates said that she simply didn't know what she did to prompt this person to feel the way they do. Which is neutral, she just doesn't know. It's also an open question. It was literally an open question, so she's acknowledging that either of them could be right. Of course, knowing her, this probably isn't the case, but since tone doesn't carry in an email, this is how most people would read it. However, when she says she's confused by what this person is saying, she's saying she has very low confidence in this person's perspective, that it's so unconcordant with reality, she can't even understand it. Then, she further accentuates that by saying, "I've only ever supported trans people." She is outright telling them that their perspective isn't concordant with reality. Oates then goes on to talk about guilt by associated, even though the initial email strongly hinted at Oates' audience as the problem. Even though it explicitly said that this wasn't meant to have anything to do with Woodford, and even though there was no hint of guilt by association anywhere at all. And I have to ask, why didn't she just wait for a response? This isn't a live medium. She doesn't have to worry about people speculating on this. She doesn't have to rebut possible arguments. She could have just waited for a response, seen it had nothing to do with guilt by association, and saved herself the time and effort. She then starts ranting about Ethel even though they weren't mentioned at all in the initial email. She says there's not going to be any reconciliation. Remember, Oates hates division, And she says that her issue with Ethel has nothing to do with the fact that they're gender fluid, even though literally no one thinks that it does. Okay, I need to go on a bit of a tangent here. Throughout this whole controversy, Oates has been insisting that transphobia means being mean to a trans person because they are trans. It doesn't, though. Transphobia is any kind of bias towards a trans person on the basis that they're trans, or any behavior that harms trans people because they're trans. You can, in fact, be transphobic without mistreating any individual trans person. Let's think about this for a second. Can you think of a reason why, for a completely, totally hypothetical example, throwing a giant tantrum over criticisms of potentially transphobic rhetoric could possibly harm both individual trans people and the trans community, even though it doesn't involve being mean to individual trans people because they are trans? Answers on a postcard, please. Send them to this address if you fancy. Anyway, she starts going on about this controversial comment she got. Basically, someone said they'd break the knees of whoever lied about her, and she hearted the comment, and no one cares. I don't even care, even though nitpicking the implicit, indirect ways she spurs her audience to violence is kind of my whole shtick with this series. She mentions it was from a 14-year-old girl, as if that has anything to do with anything. Then she makes a whole bunch of contradictory excuses for hearting it, even though it wasn't mentioned in the initial email at all. It's all just very weird. Remember, all 4 of these things were in response to someone saying, "Hey, I don't feel safe in your spaces," and that's basically it. After that, she complains that she doesn't know what's meant by her spaces, and I'd let that go as a genuine misunderstanding if she was just asking for clarification, but she launches into another rebuttal, so obviously the term wasn't that confusing. She complains about how she only has control over her YouTube and Discord, and how she can't even control her YouTube because she gets too many comments. Then, she very sincerely says, quote, "I'm sorry, but that's impossible," unquote, to the idea of moderating her comments, even though no one has ever asked her to moderate her comments. Basically, she's putting words in this person's mouth, which is hilarious when you consider how angry she gets at people making even the slightest inferences about her based on what she said, or even people who just quote her directly. So, this is a lot. Remember in my second video on Woodford, I said that often the way to detect a fake apology isn't in what's said, but in what's not said? Well, you can use that sort of technique here too. What you want to do is think of how Oates could have responded, especially try and think of it in terms of how you would respond if you had been sent that first email. For example, and of course, this isn't going to be entirely accurate because I would never end up in this situation to begin with, but I might say something like, "I'm sorry that you don't feel safe in my community. Of course, I want everyone to feel welcome, no matter who they are. I'm not sure why you feel this way though, and I'm not sure how to make things better for you. Could you go into a bit more detail or suggest a course of action? Also, I appreciate your offer to help reconcile, but I don't know you, so I don't feel comfortable having that conversation with you. Sorry about that." It could have been that simple. And when you realize we live in a world where she could have very easily said that, it says a lot that she said this instead. Aside from that, I also want to consider the tone of this original email. Specifically, this faux formal style. You all know the style. It's how you wrote your high school essays when you were trying to sound like a deep adult with deep thoughts. This style suggests someone who's either very young, or possibly disabled or mentally ill, or even all 3. Essentially, it suggests someone who's vulnerable and doesn't have all their faculties. And it's important to recognize that, because Oates' brand revolves around this idea that she's compassionate and kind and empathetic, but just look at how she responds to what could very well be a vulnerable child. By taking offense, by talking over them, by putting words in their mouth, by bombarding them with accusatory assumptions, and after all of that, by suggesting they have no reason to feel unsafe around her. But despite all that, another email was sent where the individual responds to all of these weird assumptions that come out of nowhere. For some reason, on Twitter, Oates complains that this was apparently still ongoing. Like, bitch, you asked several questions. What were you expecting? Anyway, the email begins with them saying that this isn't anything to do with guilt by association, that they in fact believe it's possible to be friends with someone who's made a mistake while standing by the people they've hurt, that they've done this themselves, and they even say that they understand why Oates would jump to that kind of conclusion, but that maybe she should consider not doing that, as it's clear that this person is coming at the issue from a unique perspective. This person is being unreasonably amicable. Then they say that this isn't about Ethel, and while they think Oates wasn't fair to Ethel, they would still feel unsafe in Oates' spaces even if Ethel wasn't involved, and they say that they never thought Oates had an issue with Ethel being gender fluid, because of course they didn't, nobody thought that. They also explained that their offer of helping with reconciliation had nothing to do with making her forgive Ethel, that it was about understanding, even if she chose not to forgive. And actually, when you think about it, they never said anything about who should be forgiving whom. For all Oates knew, they were proposing that Ethel get over his quote-unquote misunderstanding and forgive Oates, or that the rest of the trans community get over this quote-unquote misunderstanding and forgive Oates. So it's weird that Oates immediately jumps to, I won't forgive Ethel. It shows a lot of biases in her thinking. A victim complex. It shows a victim complex. Anyway, they then go so far as to say that they have no issue with the liked comment, that they actually disagree with Ethel and understand that the comment wasn't literal. Or, in other words, this person completely defies Oates' expectations in every way. After that, this person answers Oates' other questions. They clarify that Oates' spaces are her YouTube and Twitter and other places where she shares content and communicates with fans. They explain that they never intended for Oates to fully moderate her comment section, and that they're not worried about individual transphobes who might be around, but instead they believe that Oates' beliefs, attitude, statements, actions, etc. have fostered a transphobic atmosphere and fanbase. They then explained that Oates' statements have been detrimental to the well-being of trans people, that telling people who express concern to grow up and focus on the science is harmful, and that by saying these things publicly, she's teaching her audience that those responses are okay. They also further explain that they worry her fans will treat them the way she's treated others, even if it's only through sheer imitation. And you know what happened on the Twitter front? Well, I can't really show you because I didn't think to take screenshots at the time, but when these emails first went up, there were dozens of people just essentially pointing and laughing at this person for feeling unsafe, and pretending that they were asking Oates to personally protect them from the entire internet. It looks like something off a fucking Chan board. Even now, with the worst of it gone, you can see people claiming that this person is paranoid, that they're talking nonsense, even one person saying they're trying to stir the pot EOT started. And what does Oates do about this? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. But she could have. It would have taken all of 5 seconds for her to tweet something along the lines of, "It's wrong to mock people who express concern, and I don't want anyone in my fanbase being mean to the person who emailed me." Something that's important to note before we move on to Oates' response, too, is that this person closed out by saying, quote, If you've read this far, then that means a lot to me. I understand what I've written may be difficult to read, and I hope you understand that it's not my intention to be cruel or to make you feel bad about yourself." Unquote. Keep that in mind not only while we go over Oates' response, but also if you decide to look at the responses people have left on Twitter. You'll very quickly notice that Oates, who believes in listening charitably, and her audience, who are totally not toxic or problematic in the slightest, are just assuming for no fucking reason that this person is lying to her about their intentions. So she says she's sorry, quote, "if you thought I was making assumptions," unquote. Usually I'd let something like this slide given how minor it is in isolation, but given how viciously dishonest Oates has been this whole time, you're damn right I'll call her out on it. She says, "if you thought," as if this was a case of the other person being overly sensitive or misinterpreting Oates' email, but no, she was making assumptions. That's just objectively true. But instead of simply owning up to that and saying, "I'm sorry for making assumptions," she has to pretend it's up to interpretation. She just can't take responsibility for even the most trivial of her wrongdoings. She goes on to say that she was trying to address potential criticisms because the initial email wasn't specific, but, well, spoiler alert, but she will continue to address these potential criticisms long after it's been made clear that the person who emailed her wasn't going to make any of them. She's built a very convenient narrative, and she's not about to let simple listening get in the way. She also says that, actually, she wasn't the one who brought up Ethel, it was them all along. Why? Because they referenced her video discussing Ethel, where she explicitly refused to name him or his channel. Just, for all she knew, this person had no idea who Ethel was, and yet they brought him up? I'm confused. I'm very, very confused. After that, she goes on a huge rant about how Ethel did in fact lie about her. All because this person said, quote, "whether these events be actual or imagined," unquote. She's angry about them trying to be neutral when referring to events they have no intention of discussing anyway. She does this a lot. She expects you to adhere to her version of events, no matter how dubious, unsubstantiated, and or tangential it is, and if you don't, she rages at you. It's not enough to be neutral. You have to take her side every time, no questions asked. After that, she goes full armchair psychologist and asserts that Ethel is just lashing out at people because of how he was treated in the past. She, of course, fails to explain what this past trauma was, never mind providing evidence that it actually happened or caused this particular behavior. Then she elaborates on her point, which she really didn't need to because it was already clear, and she explains that she used to feel nervous around other women because she was bullied a lot growing up. This is something she's actually talked about on YouTube before. Remember that, it's important. And the reason she brings this up is to argue that, while past trauma can explain someone's behavior, it doesn't excuse it. It's up to the person who's traumatized to work through their issues rather than mistreating the people around them. And get yet another pin-up board because we're putting a pin in that too. So remember at the beginning where she basically responded to the first half of a point? She does that again. She responds to this person saying that she's been hostile towards trans people who express concern and upset, asking, "Do you have an example of this?" Ignoring that, in the email, they immediately follow up by referencing her telling people to grow up and focus on the science. She then says that she can't think of a single trans person who's approached her to express concern, which is very ironic given the circumstances. Well, except she does make an exception for Ethel and his group of friends. So forgive me if I'm being a bit paranoid here, but I have a feeling she's just going to lump in everyone who had a problem with her response to this controversy with Ethel's friends, whether they actually have any connection to Ethel or not. And even if she doesn't, she's still basically saying that several trans people criticizing her don't count just because they're associated with someone she doesn't like. Hey, I think there's a word for that. Can we just take a moment to appreciate this? Oates has spent months bitching about how people don't like her just because of guilt by association, and here she is saying this without a hint of irony. And for those of you who are going to say it's actually because these people were rude and hostile, shut up. No, it's not. If it were just rudeness, which, by the way, is a shitty reason to dismiss a member of a minority group for speaking up about their rights, she could have just said, all the trans people who've come to me with problems were rude and hostile. She didn't need to say they were friends with Ethel. She brought up Ethel so she could guilt these people by association. Then she goes on a huge rant about how she's just mad at these people for being childish and mean, and they don't get a free pass just because they're trans. She also keeps bringing up things like how she doesn't have a problem with these people for their gender identities, and how it's wrong to demonize people for being friends with people they dislike. Just all the arguments no one ever made, and arguments this person has explicitly said they don't agree with. She's not actually responding to anything this person has said or engaging with any of their arguments. She's reading off a script that she wrote and only pretending they're playing the part she wrote for them. Remember to listen charitably. This is a technique that she and other gaslighters use a lot, where they'll accuse another person of behaving in a certain way, and when the other person doesn't behave in that way, they'll just react as if they did. She's decided that you disagree with her, so she'll just react as if you disagree with her, even if you explicitly say, I agree with you. She's decided that you don't like her just because she's friends with Woodford, so she'll react as if you're only criticizing her for being friends with Woodford, even if you criticize her behavior. She's decided that you're harassing her, so she'll just react as if you're harassing her, even if you haven't said a word to her in 4 months. Also, hi Ethel, I hope you're enjoying the video. After that, Oates spends several paragraphs either telling this person that every criticism they have of her behavior is wrong, or that she doesn't understand it. She also says several times that she encourages people to speak up when they think they're being mistreated. In this email, where she's shutting someone down who's trying to speak up because they feel trans people are being mistreated. Have you ever seen a narcissist go on a tirade about how wonderful and supportive they are to someone who really needs help and support, and all the while they fail to notice that person slowly dying inside from the neglect? Have you ever had that feeling of, are you fucking kidding me? Do you not have eyes? Because I'm getting that feeling right about now. But despite how obviously disingenuous Oates is, they still respond, beginning with asking Oates how referencing her video is the same as referencing Ethel, and how that could possibly imply a whole bunch of very specific beliefs informed by him. Then they respond to her saying she couldn't think of a single trans person expressing concern, with the obvious rebuttal. After that, they explain a lot of things I'll do my best to condense. So first, they explain that the list wasn't meant to be malicious or mean, and it wasn't about, oh, we don't like this person. They explained that it was about trans people trying to avoid places that aren't safe, which trans people do, because there's a whole lot of transphobia out there. They explained that, yeah, maybe some of the names on the list didn't belong on there, but that's going to happen because trans people would rather avoid someone who turns out to be safe than be around someone who turns out to be unsafe. Then, finally, they explained that Oates did in fact tell people to grow up for criticizing Woodford, and that the gender identities of the people she was talking to were irrelevant because, like I said before, transphobia doesn't just mean being mean to someone because they are trans. They question Oates' claim that she supports people standing up for themselves on the grounds that she's shut down every point this person has made, and they remark that it seems statistically unlikely that all of their arguments are genuinely wrong. They also question Oates' claim that she's a trans advocate. They say that all she's done is acknowledge that trans people exist, and though she has said we should be treated equally, she's done it in a, quote, all lives matter, unquote, sort of way. And they even said that it's fine, that everyone does that sometimes. All they ask is that she doesn't pretend to be a proper ally when she isn't one. Finally, they end by talking about Oates' claim that Ethel's later responses to Woodford were based on personal attacks rather than science. They quote a few of Ethel's arguments and explain how these arguments aren't personal attacks, then they end with an analogy. To imagine a woman is in an engineering course and routinely subject to sexism and belittlement, and one day snaps and asks the lecturer if he'll do something, only to have the man who belittled her complain about how she should critique his maths because his behaviour has nothing to do with whether he's wrong or right. For those of you who are slow on the uptake, the point is that criticising someone for saying bigoted and discriminatory things isn't out of line or somehow anti-intellectual. Who knew? And this is where Oates decides this person is beyond all reason, because they dared to mildly contradict her a couple of times. You know how she told this person that they were wrong or that their points were unsubstantiated multiple times per email? Apparently, you can't do that to her even once or you're lashing out and getting emotional. So she begins by saying that she never said this person had beliefs informed by Ethel, which is technically true. She never said it, but she still implied it very heavily. If someone responds to a bunch of arguments you didn't make, then they say, "Oh, I'm sorry if you thought I was making assumptions, it's just you brought up this thing." That kind of implies they thought you got those arguments from the thing. That's just how things work. Then she says that she brought up the situation with Ethel and potential criticisms because they brought up the video, which is a lie. She, in fact, explicitly told them that they brought up Ethel because they brought up her video. Her exact words, if I recall correctly, were, "You brought up Ethel by mentioning my video." I really want you to absorb this. She lied to this person. She tried to make them think they were misremembering the conversation. This is literally the definition of gaslighting. And to top it all off, she asks them why they're so angry. It wasn't enough to make this person doubt their own memory, she had to try and make them doubt their own emotions too. Because if you read what they wrote, they very clearly weren't angry. They were mildly annoyed at best, yet she responds to them as if they were swearing at her and writing in all caps. Then, in response to this person arguing that they're a trans person approaching her to express concern, she brushes it off and says, quote, "Oh, I'm sorry, I should have said I can't think of another trans person approaching me before now. I didn't mean to invalidate your own experiences, I was just bringing up my own broader experiences." Unquote. So, first of all, Oates has no fucking place pulling rank on this person. Just as an example, I've personally come out as trans over 100 times. And at least the first 80 of those times were at the beginning of my transition, which was before transness was a huge social issue that everyone had an opinion on or was even aware of. I've had to introduce 80 different people to the concept of transness, most of whom were total strangers. I've had to gauge what their opinion would likely be, guess what they're likely to misunderstand, and figure out how to explain it to them, all in a split second. And I've then gone on to have extended conversations with these people where I've had to put my judgments to the test. While that doesn't make me automatically right about everything, it's fair to say I have a pretty good sense of where people are likely to stand on trans issues. So when I say there's a transphobia problem, chances are there's a transphobia problem. And plenty of other trans people have just as much and more experience than I do. Now, does that mean trans people are never wrong? No, of course not. A lot of trans people have internalized transphobia, or are privileged. That's why it's simply not enough to point out that trans people agree or disagree with you. You have to understand why we agree or disagree with you. When it comes to discrimination, bigotry, and bias, quantitative information just isn't enough. But as much as it's fun to read this literally, I think it's important to read between the lines, because, and I know this is crazy, but people can say one thing and mean another. When Oates initially said she couldn't think of a single trans person who'd approached her to express concern, she wasn't just saying that for fun. She did it for a reason, and since her goal this entire time has been to shut this person down and prove there's not a problem, no really, stop laughing, I think it's fair to say that point was something along the lines of, "You're just too sensitive. It's all in your head. This is only you. No one else has a problem." And then, when the other person said they were literally a trans person approaching her to express concern, I don't think that was a response to the surface level message, because I think they're a tad smarter than that. I think they were responding to the implied message. They were saying, "No, this isn't about other people and what they think. I have my concerns, they're legit, we're going to discuss them, stop trying to change the subject." But, of course, that wasn't going to work. Oates was just going to take it literally. And then retcon her statement because, apparently, even when she twists everything to suit her, it's still not enough. After that, she tries to explain that when she said people need to talk about the science, she meant the content of Woodford's video and how people need to explain why it's wrong rather than just calling him names. Because, you know, there's a lot of calling Woodford bad names among trans people. I've seen that so much. Just all the time. No one's been criticizing the actual content of his video, we just call him names all day. Also, Oates can fuck right off with that retcon. You can't just decide that the science means the science, but also a bunch of other things. That's not how words work. After that, she argues that she has in fact supported trans people, and she has a bit of a tantrum about, "Do I need to go through every video and pick out the bits where I supported trans people?" She's doing several things here. First is, well, she's just lying. I was a fan of Oates, and I can assure you her videos don't have any support of trans people in them. Unless you count occasionally acknowledging that people who identify as a gender other than the one they were assigned at birth exist, and not explicitly attacking them, to be supportive of trans people, which only a transphobe would. But anyone who isn't already at the point of dismissing everything she says as blatant lies isn't going to think that way. So when they look back on her videos and fail to remember any support of trans people, they're going to assume they're the ones at fault and that they remembered wrong. Second, she's distracting from the issue, the complete lack of evidence, with the emotional response of indignation. This itself does several things. It demands sympathy because she's upset. It disincentivizes logical discussion or challenge because she's angry. And it also presents a flashy spectacle that will help people forget that she's dodging the criticism rather than engaging with it. And third, she's presenting a false dichotomy. According to her, she can either provide no evidence or go through the ridiculously grueling task of compiling all of it, and nothing in between. By reacting this way, she's tricking people into thinking that this person has asked her for something unreasonable, because not many people are going to think she'd respond with this level of indignation over something that didn't even happen. Even the asker themselves might end up thinking, I must have asked her to provide this ridiculous amount of evidence, otherwise, why would she think that I had? When we look at the situation with a calm, critical eye, it seems ridiculously hollow and like it'd never work, but the lizard brain just sees someone angry and assumes they're angry for a reason. Then, after that Gordian knot of gaslighty bullshit, she says that she's supported trans people in videos, live streams, and offline, and that this person doesn't have the right to say she's not a trans ally because of that. And now, we have even more to unpack. Okay, so videos. Like I said, this is just a complete fucking lie. In all my time watching Oates' videos, seeing almost every single video she's ever done up until this controversy, the only thing I've seen from her regarding trans people is her either briefly acknowledging the existence of trans people so she can spend the whole video pretending that penis equals man and vagina equals woman because she's too lazy to be inclusive, or her including trans people in her extremely vapid "be nice to everyone" speech that I tore to pieces way back in section 1. And guess what? That there isn't being an ally, it's the barest minimum. It's like she briefly heard about trans people once and decided to not hate us. But she clearly doesn't care enough about trans people to actually support us. And that would be fine. Except she's so adamant that she is a trans ally and she'll attack anyone who says otherwise. As for live streams, I can't comment because I haven't seen them, because they weren't what I would come to her channel for. This is a bit of a nuanced point, so bear with me, but YouTube audiences don't watch every little thing creators put out. I know, crazy, right? And live streams in particular will usually be ignored because they tend to be long, unpolished, and less content-rich compared to prepared content. Not that it matters, because if she really supported trans people, this should be apparent in all her content, from live streams to Twitter. Then she talks about her behaviour offline. Offline! Remember how I said we'd discuss Oates' theory of mind in this video? Well, here it is. Before, she had no issue with relaying her experiences to this person, even though she'd already discussed them in one of her videos and they were publicly available. She understood that they just might not have seen that video, or they might not remember it. But now, when she feels like taking things personally, suddenly she expects them to not only have watched all her videos and live streams and committed all of them to memory, but to have a magic scrying crystal to know what goes on in her personal life. Oates is perfectly capable of communicating when she thinks she's owning someone, but when she's in trouble, suddenly she has amnesia and some kind of developmental regression. But what really pisses me off is she says this person, this trans person, doesn't have the right to say she's not an ally to trans people. Now, I'll admit that I'm mostly mad because this is a pet peeve of mine, but I think it holds up too. If someone says something about you that you don't like, your response should be that they shouldn't say it because it's demonstrably false or based on poor reasoning, not because you're offended by it. I personally just can't imagine getting mad at someone for criticizing me without being able to explain why their criticism is wrong and stupid and wrong. Anyway, after that, she decides to end it once and for all. She says that she doesn't think there's anything she can do to please this person, despite the fact that she's tried absolutely nothing so far, except ignore all their concerns, put words in their mouth, and gaslight the fuck out of them. Then, she says she hopes they stop being angry and stop seeing the entire world as out to get them. Oh my god, you guys, I think I figured out the identity of this mystery person. Okay, jokes aside, there's actually something I need to tell you. I sent the email. I'll just give you a moment to pick your jaws up off the floor. Okay, that's enough. So, I have some explaining to do. First of all, clearly there wasn't any suicide. I promise I'm not a ghost. And luckily, I didn't spiral into a depression or start having panic attacks. While this whole thing has had an impact on me, it's been manageable. Though, on the other hand, there is a reason this video took so long to come out. So, if I've been impacted, you can just imagine how horribly someone would be affected by the situation if they were already suicidal, or if they were already dealing with panic attacks, or if they were a child, or if they had a more severe mental disability, or even if they were just a huge fan of Rachel Oates who used to look up to her and consider her channel a safe space for them. I went into these emails knowing that Rachel Oates had major issues, knowing that it could all go horribly wrong, and expecting the worst. So imagine just how someone would be affected if they wrote those emails expecting things to go well. Now, you're probably wondering what the fuck I was thinking, and if you're not, I'm going to pretend you are because it's convenient for me. Basically, I was working on the script, going through Oates' video and tweets, and trying to figure out what exactly her deal was. But I didn't feel like I had enough to make a solid case. Of course, given how my analysis turned out, I realized it would have been fine on its own, but at the time I was still processing all of this and I didn't know which way was up, to be honest. So what I did was I essentially designed an experiment. For those of you who don't know, if you pare down the scientific method to its barest essence, what you've got is, it's the act of coming up with a way to distinguish between a world in which something is true and a world in which it's not true. So, for example, if you wanted to test whether your desk was solid, you'd simply touch it. And in the world where your desk is solid, your hand comes into contact with it and stops. And in the world where your desk isn't solid, your hand goes right through. It's as simple as that. For my experiment, what I did was I wrote the email with the assumption that everything Oates says about herself is correct. I assumed she believed in listening charitably. I assumed she hated division. I assumed she just wanted the community to go back to normal again. I assumed she valued letting YouTubers learn from their mistakes. I assumed she was an ally to trans people. I assumed she had compassion and wanted the best for people. I assumed all of it. That's why if you read over my email again, it seems a lot like it's tailored to pander to all of her sensibilities. It's because it literally was. The only thing I didn't assume was I didn't assume she would be receptive to criticism, because I knew she wouldn't be, and I couldn't risk scaring her off right away. I needed to get her talking. In other words, what I did was I presented her with a big, juicy piece of bait. But this wasn't bait designed to lure her into any kind of trap. It was designed to simply lure her out, to get her sharing her authentic thoughts. So I asked her an open question that she could answer in a myriad of ways. And she immediately jumped on, contradicting every single assumption I'd made about her. I assumed she'd listen to me, and she actively ignored every word I said. I assumed she'd want to repair the rift in the community, and she told me up front she wouldn't reconcile. I assumed she'd be compassionate, and she took to Twitter to publicly disparage and mock me. Then, after seeing that, I did what you're never supposed to do when you conduct an experiment. I tried to intervene because I didn't like the results. I tried to steer her towards charitable listening by repeatedly pointing out that I didn't believe the things she thought I did, and by literally saying that maybe she should listen to me because I had a unique perspective. I tried to steer her towards compassion by writing little analogies for her, and pointing out that the people she was so angry at probably felt the same way she did, but worse. I tried to steer her towards reconciliation by telling her that she didn't have any obligation to forgive anyone, and that I just wanted to foster understanding. And every single time, she slapped my hands off the steering wheel and veered hard in the opposite direction. But anyway, I promised to explain the Nazi bits, so I guess we'll do that now. The Nazi discussion was not part of my original plan. That happened because I got myself worked up because, well, I know it's kind of weird of me, but I'm afraid of Nazis. What happened was, while I was looking through Oates' tweets, I noticed a couple with a Clown Pepe as the profile picture, both showing support for Oates' attacks on trans people. Now, you might not know this, but Pepes, and Clown Pepes in particular, are a symbol Nazis use to signal to each other that they're Nazis, and this made me think that, perhaps, Nazis were infiltrating Oates' spaces. I know that might sound crazy to the uninitiated, so even though I condemn Vosh as a YouTuber, I've put a link in the description to his video explaining all of this, because it's literally the only one that does. But if you don't want to watch that video, the TLDW is that the now deleted Clown World meme video, where the Clown Pepe originates, was just packed to the brim with Nazi dog whistles. Literally 90% of the comments, like, I am not exaggerating, it was actually roughly 9 out of 10 comments, were something along the lines of 13% of honklers commit 50% of honks, or what advocates for no borders but has many walls. These are both dog whistles. The first refers to black people and crime rates in the United States, and the second one refers to Israel. The Clown World meme is a Nazi dog whistle. That is just a fact. Anyway, in my initial email, I explained my concerns. I explained that Nazis want to hurt people, So if they like what you're doing, chances are what you're doing is hurting people or enabling them in hurting people. I also say that I don't think she's a bad person and that this says nothing about her intentions. This is a statement she will go on to ignore for the rest of the conversation. I then link the video explaining the Nazi connection to the Clown World meme. Oates responds by saying that she doesn't know what I'm talking about and that she's not responsible for what other people do. Then she makes the analogy that a child molester can like dogs and she can like dogs, but that doesn't make her a pedophile. Dishonesty aside, that really wasn't pleasant to read at the time. Or now. I think we need to consider, as a culture, toning down the use of child abuse as a metaphor when we're talking to strangers, because you never know when you're talking to someone who was in fact abused as a child. She also says that she hasn't said anything racist, so Nazis wouldn't agree with her. Just for the record, the original Nazis hated trans people too. My god, these arguments are such a bloody mess. So my response is a bit convoluted because I really wanted to work in some quotes I'd read. On reflection, probably a bad idea, but it's done now. Anyway, I explained that there's a difference between something being logically inevitable and something being possible or likely, and I say that we should consider, maybe, trying to prevent bad things even if they're not guaranteed. You know, this crazy idea that maybe we should try and stop Nazis before they become a problem. I then explain that Nazis aren't just racist but also hate all minorities, which I thought was common knowledge. And I also explain that being a pedophile isn't the same as being a Nazi, and that liking dogs isn't the same as making a political statement, though I don't know why I bothered, she was clearly being dishonest from the very start. I also directed her to one of the accounts I was talking about, and mentioned she showed the tweet in her video. You know, because she said she didn't know what I was talking about, so I thought I'd show her. And now for some things that went on behind the scenes. When I went looking for this person, I had to find their handle so I could tell Oates who they were, right? Well, I noticed that while I previously thought there were 2 Nazis, there was in fact only 1. And then I realized I probably should have checked their Twitter to see if they were actually a Nazi. So I did that, and I couldn't find any conclusive evidence of them being a Nazi, and I said as much. Though I also said we can't be sure because Nazis usually don't go around leaving evidence of their fascist leanings. And I also basically said I was probably overly cautious and possibly wrong, but that when it comes to Nazis, it's better safe than sorry. Right? None of this was exactly new information. My whole point from the very beginning was to tell her to keep an eye out, not that there were definitely Nazis all over her spaces. But, fun fact, since then, I found another tweet responding to these emails Oates shared that contains Nazi dog whistles in the tweet itself. These clowns and these honks here, they have no reason to be there unless this person is trying to tell other Nazis that they're a Nazi. No normal person speaks like this. Even if you want to insist that they're just using a non-existent, non-Nazi version of the meme, at best, that would mean they're saying that a trans person being concerned about possible transphobia is something that can only happen in a world run by clowns. So, good job proving my point, idiot. As for her response, Oates complains about how this tweet I referenced was only in her video for a few seconds. Okay? Then she starts complaining about endorsement. Basically, she thinks I was accusing her of endorsing this person because they were included in her video. No. No, I wasn't. I was giving her my source like she asked. If I wanted to accuse her of endorsing this person, I would have actually done that. After that, she says she meant to censor everyone in the video, which is a blatant lie. See her video, where she doesn't censor most of the tweets. Then she complains that she's human and she makes mistakes. She, however, doesn't apologize to me for getting really mad at me for making a mistake. Apparently, she's the only one who can make mistakes, and you're supposed to know what she did was a mistake before she acknowledges it. But if you make a mistake and acknowledge it, well, you shouldn't have done that in the first place. Double standards. Then she says that this person was actually agreeing with me and Ethel. Then she rants a whole bunch about how this person has trans-friendly resources in their feed, which I didn't see when I checked, by the way. Then she goes on about how ridiculous and wrong my claims are. Remember, this is after I said I was perhaps a bit too cautious and possibly wrong. She could have just said, "Oh yeah, I get it, Nazis are a big deal, but I've looked and I don't think they were a Nazi." She really didn't need to take this personally. In response, I tell her I wasn't accusing her of endorsing a Nazi. I explain that this person wasn't actually agreeing with Ethel, but discrediting his objections on the grounds that it's a response to past trauma rather than current events. And I semi-sincerely, but also semi-facetiously, apologize for failing to check this person's feed to see if they're a Nazi, when their profile picture is a Nazi dog whistle. I also say that it's weird this person would approach her about my concerns, and ask if other people have warned her about Clown Pepes. I intentionally did that to get her to fess up about sharing my emails to see how honest she'd be. So she responds. She seems to think that saying Nazis are endorsing her, and that reflects on her behavior, means that she's endorsing Nazis? No. That's not what that word means. Endorsing something and being endorsed by something are about as similar as eating an ice cream is to being eaten by an ice cream. They're not interchangeable, Rachel. Please go back to preschool and learn how syntax works. Then she reiterates that I must think she's endorsing Nazis by putting them in her video. Well, I don't remember exactly what I said in the email, and I'm too lazy to check. I'm pretty sure I already told her at this point that I didn't believe that. But then again, when have I ever been able to convince Oates that I don't believe something by saying, "I don't believe that"? Then she decides to reword her point, and honestly, I'm not even summarizing it. Fuck her and her dishonest retcons. Then she says that they weren't discrediting Ethel, they were trying to explain Ethel's behavior. She says that as if I didn't think of that and explain why that's not the case in the email. I'd feel insulted if I didn't know she was being dishonest. After that, she tries to catch me contradicting myself. She asks how it's okay for me to justify the actions of the list makers on the grounds that they're doing it because of their past experiences, but it's not okay for other people to say that Ethel is acting the way he is because of past experiences. But I never said that. You do all know that trans people aren't super wary of transphobia just because we've personally experienced it, right? Sure, some of it is down to personal experiences, but it's also because we know a lot of people are transphobic, and even more people are tolerant of transphobia even if they're not actively transphobic themselves. It's because of the culture, not isolated experiences. But despite that, she keeps banging on this narrative that being wary of discrimination is the same as being traumatized. She also further implies that trans people are being unfair if we don't confirm that everyone we avoid is definitely transphobic. She compares it to how she used to flip out at women for being women. But, well, here's a crazy idea. How about, if you don't want people thinking you're transphobic, you don't make it so hard for people to figure out whether or not you're transphobic. Women can't help being women, but you can help coming across as a bigoted jerk. And then we get to my trap. Oates did opt to tell me that she shared the email, explaining that she shared it because she wanted advice. This, however, is a lie. How do I know that? Well, I could argue that she didn't need to go to the internet for advice, that she could have privately asked one of her many friends and colleagues on YouTube or simply ignored the email altogether, but I don't need to make that argument to prove she's lying. All I have to do is look at her tweets. If you look, you'll notice she made quite a few aggressive and disparaging comments about my emails, but ignore that for a second. If you look at her tweets, you'll notice that she shared both my email and her response simultaneously every time. How was the feedback supposed to work if she'd already written her reply? Obviously, it wasn't.
I've no more fucks to give, my fuck rations are depleted. I've rallied my fuck army, but it's been fucking defeated.
I know this has been long, and you must be tired, so I'll be brief. Oates has been dishonest, vicious, and hypocritical throughout this whole affair, and try as she might to chalk this up to simple misunderstanding, I've still confirmed multiple lies on her part. However, it's important for us to understand that she's not doing this purely for the sake of malice. While there could be some malice mixed in there, it's clear that she's not mentally well. Something has made her insecure, paranoid, overly sensitive, and anxious, and she clearly has very low self-esteem. And as someone who's also not mentally well and who's a complete mess because of it, I think it's wrong to give her a hard time. She's clearly struggling, and being hard on her is only going to make things worse. But, as she herself has so eloquently said, while past trauma can explain someone's behavior, it does not excuse it. And I can only assume that extends to other mental illnesses as well. So, since she's been so adamant in her demand for an apology from Ethel for his lying about her, and since she's gone and assured us that there's no excuse for her behavior, I think it's only fair that, in light of this video, she publicly apologized to Ethel, to Ethel's friends, to the trans community, and to me for her harassment, abuse, bullying, her transphobia, and her lies. And if I could just talk to you directly, Rachel, I want to say, get help. Get off the internet, quit YouTube, get a quiet, low-stress job, find a good therapist, make some new friends, and work through your problems. I'm not being facetious, really. Do it, because it's clear you're not functioning properly. And as much as I'm angry at you for your abuse of me and dozens of other trans people, I do want you to get better. I want you to stop being so angry and stop seeing the entire world as out to get you. Get help. Also, stop attacking trans people, you disgusting transphobe.
I've